Welcome, and thank you for tuning in to the Supply Chain Dialogues podcast, where we will be diving into the procurement, supply chain, and operations management world. We got insights for you into new, old, and even outdated truths, and hopefully that will make you more successful in your job by expanding your knowledge of solutions which are out there. My name is Daniel Helmig, your host for the show. I ran supply chains, procurements, and operations globally in 5 industries for more years than I care to remember.
And I'm Amy, the AI-generated co-host voice of the show. I will ask the questions and provide from time to time facts and figures provided from my other AI siblings.
Thank you, Amy, and let's dive into the show. This episode is called Stopping Constant Organizational Redesign by Fixing the Functional Setup. This is the second installment of the mini-series about organizational design, where we look at ways to stop the constant reshuffling we see in companies with often little to no sustainable benefit for customers and the balance sheets. We are convinced that if you design your organization in line with the culture and the surrounding markets, the costly needs of reorganizations and internal reshuffling can be minimized. Today we will talk about functional design, and we will take one function particularly as a guinea pig. The function is going to be procurement, but most of the factors and solutions we discuss here also apply to other discretionary functions in the operations space: sales, planning, service, manufacturing, you name it. If you have missed the first part of the series on corporate headquarter design, feel free to listen to this podcast first. It explains, among other things, why we call operations as discretionary. So all operations folks, no reason to get your knickers into a twist. Just listen to the episode 1 of the mini-series. So what is the right procurement function setup? Central, decentral, or hybrid? If you've asked this question until 2010, many of my peers and I would have answered in the best Mandalorian: centralization is the way. But why, right? We assessed procurement performance in the 90s and early 2000s by economies of scale and skill. Since we'll come back to this several times, let us be specific about these two concepts. So on the one hand side, we have economies of scale. That means big volume, more cost, in simple terms. Something that was for a long time the panacea for being cost competitive in many industries. Economies of scale refer to the cost advantages that business can achieve by increasing their production levels. As production volume increases, the cost per unit of output decreases thanks to efficiencies in many areas such as purchasing, production, distribution, and as well the distribution of fixed cost over more units. Today, however, with the emergence of smaller and smaller batch sizes due to customer demand, shorter product life cycles, and in general, higher demand and supply volatility, it feels a little bit like shooting with cannons to kill sparrows. Economies of scale is a term that I may have come across either in my readings in the past or I coined myself many years ago. The concept involves consolidating resources within a centralized organization to recruit top-notch talent with specialized knowledge. Sun Tzu, the famous Chinese general who lived in the Eastern Shu period around 6th to 5th century BC, writes in his famous military treatise, The Art of War, "If you know the other side and know thyself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." Sun Tzu emphasizes that understanding your opponent's strengths, weaknesses, motivations, and tendencies is essential to developing effective strategies and tactics. Sun Tzu also warns against underestimating or overestimating the other side and stresses the importance of adapting to changing circumstances and being flexible. In cases where buyers are responsible for multiple spend categories and markets, their ability to understand the market, the individual market, and the player's strength in this market, weaknesses, motivations, and so on, is hampered by the sheer size of the battlegrounds and opposing parties. And from experience, I fully align with this. If you have generalists, you normally have higher cost, in procurement at least. Now, what then about the approach to have these super knowledgeable and very smart global procurement category leaders who know it all? Well, even in the large automotive companies with numerous buyers managing various components, global category leadership and management lacks a comprehensive view of the global supply market. Despite their intelligence and talent, these individuals are shaped by their upbringing and regional supply market perspective. Furthermore, the more centralized decision-making is delegated to them, the more time they spend coordinating with different parts of the organization and with that losing touch with their primary responsibility of understanding the supply market and its players. In the late 90s of the last century, Ford Motor Company wanted to become a global corporation rather than a bunch of more or less regional cells, and was planning to centralize at some point everything. This was a huge undertaking with thousands of consultants and people across the world coming together in Detroit to create this new setup. I was early 30s and suddenly had a ticket to fly to Michigan, USA, to work on a design and roll out even a new Kanban system for 90 assembly plants across the world. It was fun. At the same point in time, other colleagues in sales, procurement, and R&D centralized in line with corporate strategy. In procurement, Ford implemented central global category management, and in R&D, decision-making in design and development, so how the cars looked and what features they should have. Now, fast forward 5 years. Due to many reasons, this global focus tempered back a bit to a very rational setup Ford still has today because, well, two things happened. The actual material costs for the vehicles that were bought with global economies of scale were uncompetitive, since the quality and design criteria used to define the specifications were mainly, you guessed it, US-based, which no European buyer and as well R&D person would have accepted. So what happened was that change notices were suddenly written and the suppliers could take back what they lost before. Change notices is beautiful for any supplier in the automotive industry if there is not an excellent cost estimating function behind that. The worst part was that the products were launched and fit the appeal of the US decision makers a few years back, but not the general public in Europe. Heck, vehicles were launched with names like Probe, which in German, for example, means prototype or experiment. You can imagine what the neighbor said when you drove towards your house or your flat or whatever. Hey, you got your new experiment, how is it? So overall sales dropped dramatically. Now I could tell you all evening stories about similar experiences that other companies made, centralizing in Europe, Asia, doesn't matter. My point is that economies of scale and skill have limits, and these limits are mainly us, the people involved. Now, as you can see, going through all different alternatives between decentralized or centralized functions, it is often a decision between a rock and a hard place. And whatever you choose, you just have to basically manage inside of the new concept that you apply. Therefore, it is crucial to recognize that a function cannot operate in isolation. Just organizing for economies of scale can be, as the British say, penny wise but pound foolish. While you can optimize input costs, such as raw materials and services to a certain extent, procurement is only one of several operational functions that must align with the broader context of the organization and its culture. And this is where normally the real magic can happen. When an organization is decentralized and business targets are achieved through regional or business unit autonomy, procurement functions should also be decentralized. The modest gain achieved through economies of scale are outweighed by the increased coordination effort and potential latency associated with centralized procurement, as well as the exclusion from management circles where centralized personnel may not be readily accepted. I still know the joke from the past, "Hi, I'm from headquarters and here to help. Please fill out my Excel sheet." In a highly centralized organization, assessing whether your supply markets are organized similarly is essential, by the way, as well, the customer markets. While your customers may demand centralization in the front end, particularly in B2B relationships with large multinational global players, your manufacturing and supply base may still be optimally organized decentrally. Ignoring this fact and continuing to purchase centrally because you have a central organization may lead to increased cost and reduced innovation due to the need. I have frequently observed more innovative solutions and better pricing from agile companies aligned with supply markets than from some of the large companies I was working for and with. It is essential to acknowledge as well one last point with regard to how an organizational setup is being defined, and that you could call it the dark side of organizational design. It's not based on facts, but more oversized egos. Some leaders still adopt Machiavellian approaches by building insular, hierarchical solutions at the functional or business unit level. Instead of using influence and cooperation, they rely on direction and autocracy. These leaders exist in every company, and as long as they succeed in their little sandbox, the cart house they built remains often standing. During my business career, I've encountered many of these little Machiavellians, each of whom had a little empire with everything the large corporation normally had as well. All failed over time, resulting in quite harsh negative margins and revenue consequences for the company, and as well the company culture. As one colleague succinctly put it, they starved the goose that laid the golden egg. I am baffled that most HR processes can still not operationalize the detection of what psychologists call the dark triad of personality traits, namely Machiavellism, narcissism, and a lack of empathy in employees and later leaders. Interestingly enough, as I was told, it's actually just a simple test to take. Now let's look at what it takes to align the functional design with the overall corporate design and mainly culture. And there are actually quite a lot of different models to assess corporate culture. The model that worked for me in the last 15 years is from a book called Die 3 Faktoren des Einkaufs, The 3 Factors of Procurement by S. Schumacher, H. Schiele, and M. Conson and T. Zacher. It's from 2008. They use a two-dimensional matrix of the degree of governance, leading via organization and process, leading via targets and strong personalities, and the decision style, which is either consent or hierarchy-driven. Once internalized, it allowed me quickly to design functional organizations in line with companies' cultures, or even say thank you but no thank you to job offers from firms where I felt that their culture did not align with what they wanted me to do with their procurement. Aspiring to have a centralized procurement when the governance happens via individual business targets or is driven by consent is a fool's errand, as it is to continue with a decentral procurement setup in an organization with a transparent process-driven culture and strong hierarchical decision structure. Now, some will tell you that there is a golden path to get all of the above and more. It's called the hybrid functional model. I will not spend too much time on this, since I have found that it takes a tremendous amount of effort from the Chief Procurement Officer and the procurement leadership team to keep this up and running, balancing out all forces of the organization. In my view, it was not worth the effort. So, let's look at the approach to functional design. While there is no one-size-fits-all approach to organizational design, as we have discussed before for procurement and most other functions, it is essential to consider factors such as fit for function, no pun intended, and fit for culture alignment. Based on my over 3 decades of experience running operations, supply chains, and procurement across 5 industries, I found that the most effective organizational functional design approach involves small, decentralized units operating interdependently within the larger organizational hierarchy. These units must be connected via a structured virtual knowledge network with governance swim lanes such as payment terms, contracts, skill level training, functional career paths as needed, and systems linked into centrally provided data lakes. This decentralized setup boasts high level of agility and digitalization. There is one exception. For fully centralized organizations, overall design and culture should remain the primary focus. Hence, the centralized functional design for procurement should prevail. And a word concerning the span of control of these organizational setups. Units, for example, strategic sourcing teams, should be large enough to reduce the micromanagement of managers, but small enough to allow for effective interactions. Some general guidelines suggest that there is an ideal size of a departmental unit that can run from 5 to 12 people, and then replicate it in small units up to 12 times. This is known as the Dunbar's number, named after anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who proposed that humans can comfortably maintain social relationships with a maximum of 150 people, with smaller groups being more effective in communication and coordination. So let's talk about the gap and the opportunity that you might have here. We are now equipped with enough definitions and analytics to see whether we can identify a gap and use this as an opportunity to close it. Let's start by identifying where your company is on the spectrum of functional design and whether a gap reveals itself when you review the statements that Amy will talk about. How many of the questions or statements can you answer with a resounding, fact-based yes in your head?
Our procurement organization is aligned with the overall company organization, whether centrally, by business unit, or by geography.
We discussed this before, so it's quite straightforward.
Our supply chain has minimal disruptions, including delayed deliveries and unexpected increases in material costs.
It is like a fever that runs through the corporate body, increasing the temperature of friction when the supply chain is not handled from the customer backwards. Every internal fight about competencies increases the temperature, leading to a weak body, or in our terms, performance.
Performance is consistently tracked throughout the company, including metrics such as cost reduction, number of suppliers, procurement to payment time, greenhouse gas emissions of suppliers, and other sustainability metrics.
This is something that is not apparent on the first glance. You get numbers reported by all entities. They all sound the same from a headline perspective: cost reduction, margin, customer retention, share of wallet, NPS score, headcount, you name it. And then, when you look under the curtain, you find out that each entity is measuring differently. Often to make numbers look better, on other times because that's how they did it always and no one told them differently, or they did not listen. Either way. So performance metrics, KPIs, need to be defined and standardized both on the nominator and denominator side. And the algorithm needs to be defined as well. This is particularly important if you run your organization decentrally. You need to at least have a common way to measure performance and find gaps to close. And if you believe that this cannot happen in your company, trust me, it does, unless you have an ironclad handle on that already.
Our procurement organization is competitive within our industry regarding productivity and spending per employee. Any deviation from this benchmark is a deliberate decision in line with our organizational setup.
There are many different benchmarks that you can get from consulting companies, the Hackett Group, and many more. Like the last statement, it depends on the nominator and denominator. Procurement is not equal procurement from one company or industry to the next. It's the same for every function. There is no standard design of a functional setup, so inherently all benchmarks have flaws. The better ones, you get to have a definition section for the baseline, which is good to understand before making decisions that you later regret. An example: highly regulated industries tend to have more people and functions. If you try to bring your function headcount down to, let's say, a less regulated industry, you will lose performance and, worst case, compliance. So first, use some common sense about benchmarks, use them for what they are suitable for, and then establish a target based on some kind of data set. And then build your functional design that makes sense for your company and your culture.
Each division, business unit, and function within our company value the procurement performance.
You can make the same point about marketing, sales, service, and finance. Do the people in the regions and businesses feel that the money they pay in terms of allocation is seen as money well spent? Yeah. Whether it is an allocation from corporate or part of the normal local allocation of functional cost that has an impact and reduces their margins. The validity of the feedback depends on the maturity of the leadership involved and whether or not political considerations are at play. I mentioned the dark tribe before. So feedback should be gathered as scientifically as possible in any current state assessment to be usable in the future state functional design. I've found that procurement is appreciated, for example, when they're just intelligent typewriters and doing nothing more than being the extended arms of the internal customers, calm and placid. On the other side, when procurement is a fierce supply chain warrior with a deep commercial aptitude, their colleagues appreciate it in any interaction with the supply base. It is like Henry Ford once said, if I've asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So while evaluating the perceived value added is essential, it takes a certain amount of arm's length grown-up evaluation of what you get back.
Our procurement is adequately funded, even acknowledged by the head of procurement or supply chain and through industry benchmarks.
Most functions believe they are underfunded. Often they are. Even more often, they're just not clear what their real job is, and they like to expand into areas that no one in the company sees the need. Assuming she knows what she is proposing, it is up to the functional leader to make the argument for more budget linked to the value add of the company. If the leader is not able to articulate this, or the arguments fall on deaf ears, then the company deserves the function it has and all its strengths and shortcomings.
Our supply base is smaller in comparison to our competitors.
I was never a big fan of supplier reduction as a factor for itself. Well, yes, every supplier is a potential risk, cybersecurity and otherwise, and yes, every supplier needs to be identified, evaluated, qualified, etc. So it's a lot of work. But using the symptom of bad supply chain or procurement management to result in accounting of suppliers is rubbish. I've seen too many organizations that fulfill their targets by consolidating their red tail of suppliers, that's the small volume suppliers, with no impact whatsoever on cost or any other meaningful metric. But as an overall understanding of how many suppliers you have versus your competition gives you at least a direction whether you have some form of control of your extended enterprise. Because let's face it, how many is a company that does 50,000 Swiss francs or US dollars or euro really interested in helping you? Or if they have 100 other customers that do more revenue than you, how much are they willing to cooperate on innovational design, new materials, ESG optimization? Zero, zilch, nothing, null, nada. They are not interested. That is the reason less suppliers can be good if they are managed well. And that brings us to our topic of functional design again. Whether you're centralized, decentralized, or organized in any other way, in the same company you should have an understanding what the other brothers and sisters are doing and have swim lanes that prevent cancerous growth of the extended enterprise.
Our procurement team is incentivized based on the overall performance of the business area they are connected to.
If you are not in procurement and listening in, do you believe the savings and other KPIs your procurement is reporting? Do you even care to understand them? Are they honestly adding to your bottom line? If you feel this is at least questionable, you are in good company. Many people in companies have a hard time understanding and believing in functional reporting. Whether it is purchasing, sales, like for example, anyone believes share of wallet reporting or market penetration, or R&D, for example, time it takes from initiation to finalization of the project, value add creation, etc. The issue is that functions are allowed to create their own reporting. It's a bad idea, but often linked to as well of how they are measured. If you stop measuring procurement based just on savings, but on margin creation of the whole business unit, you get somewhere. Should they then report as well savings, price increase, number of suppliers, and so? Yeah, they should. But they should be paid in line with all the other peoples in the business. How much did we sell, make margins, and contribute to the overall value of the company? Everything else are functional metrics, while this one is a key performance indicator. It helps people and especially leaders to think as teams and not as representatives of their function.
The corporate overhead for this function is less than 10% of the overall personal cost.
You can go even deeper to 5 to 6%, but it really depends on your company's organizational design. And depending on how you organize, 10 or 11% can be okay if the value from the consolidated, wait for it, economies of scale setup leads to good returns in the business.
Procurement only reports to the head of the supply chain if the person held a previous position as the chief procurement officer.
My apologies to all supply chain heads. Many of you do a super job keeping the flow going despite all the headwinds you get in the company. But when it comes to procurement, supply chain heads that have less of a commercial but more a flow or manufacturing mindset struggle with procurement as a function. The same is with sales heads and marketing. For the non-anointed, it looks like a great fit, but just ask your marketing folks. better to consolidate these functions under a COO or Chief Commercial Officer, but do not let them report into themselves. So, if you answered yes to most questions, great. You have your organization procurement design under control. Congratulations. Well done. Do not listen further. Do something else that interests you and do not bother with this podcast any longer. However, if you do not know or answered several questions or statements with a no, you can make your company more stable and competitive. And to understand the size of the prize, as always, let's use a couple of simple steps to establish the gap and a target.
Short term, first, establish your annual cost reduction level over the last 3 to 5 years. Bonus question: do you believe the reporting? Are finance, business unit management, and procurement aligned? Secondly, if between 2 to 3%, set a 4 to 5% target for the next 2 years. This is your gross margin improvement level opportunity, the size of the prize. Long term, set a joint target between organizationally aligned sales, operations, and procurement of 5% plus gross margin improvement based on cross-functional optimization projects, annually for 3 years. Establish a transparent cost tool with finance that helps you ensure that the gross margin increase is used towards EBIT and investments in the future.
So now we have the size of the prize, and always at the end of our podcast, we then look at a potential way of how you can actually set up a project to get there. So we will go step by step by starting once again with a time plan. It's about 15 months, 3 months for blueprint design and then 12 months for implementation. The board sponsor, management board sponsor, should be the CEO or CFO. The lead should be, depending on the functional setup, the head of procurement or head of operations. When you look at the project setup, work with HR on establishing the firm's organizational and cultural design. That's a given. Build a new updated functional blueprint that is in line with the cultural design and as well with the market. After board agreement, establish a weekly task force with clear objectives following the blueprint design. Quarterly reporting on management board level by the CPO, Chief Procurement Officer, with clear output KPIs, like, for example, design finalized and approved, the number of categories in new control, number of headcount in new design setup, percentage of categories covered via category strategies, the trend of supplier reduction, suppliers selected in line with swim lanes. Now, how do we sustain then the success? We need to communicate successes regularly with a new setup and stay in contact at least quarterly with the business and the regional presidents to ensure that the new reporting or the updated reporting actually is in line with what these people expect. How about the digitalization automation opportunity? And overall, we'll see it as medium. The time of big ERP systems to support organizational design solutions are long gone. With the right APIs and process mining software, every system in each corner of the corporation can be cleaned up and linked to a large data lake, which can be used for spotting optimization potential, monitoring compliance, and cross-sharing of suppliers and solutions. On the risk side, we believe it's overall quite low, because procurement is like a bicycle. You will always get somehow from point A to point B. The right bicycle and care will decide how quickly you get there and how much effort it takes. Changing procurement wrongly will not break the company, but it might cost you percentages of gross margin and unhappy customers for a while. So how is the cost of this whole project? Overall, we see it as very low. Either you set up an internal task force full-time or employ some external support. If external support is used, as always, we recommend having internal resources shadow the consultants to have a knowledge transfer guaranteed. Now let's talk about the watch-outs. Don't stop implementation midway. Missing discipline in implementing change, for example, by giving in to dark triad business leaders in functions or business units, can as well be terrible. Selecting the right functional leaders that can actually work in the new setup. It can be that the old guard is not necessarily the best new guard. Thank you for being interested in the second part of the mini-series about organizational design, this time with a focus on functional design. Hope you will enjoy as well part 3. When we talk about roles and responsibilities, competency and job design, we will show that the design works around the division of labor are as important today as when they were invented in the 18th century.
Did you enjoy this podcast? Sign up for the Close the Gap blog and the Supply Chain Dialogues podcast on our webpage, or listen in on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you are interested in having a dialogue about the above, receiving some advisory support on how to tackle the topic best in your firm, maybe getting a talk with your team, or just would like an exploratory call with Daniel, then contact us with the web form on our website or just give us a call.
Nothing more to say besides stay safe and be bold. Goodbye.